I'm the editor-in-chief of the online social theory magazine Egyenlőség. And this session today, which is actually two sessions in one, is part of a series that we call közbeszélgetések, public conversations. And basically the idea is to take this online magazine a little bit offline and meet real people in real settings where we can have conversation with our authors. We've had a lot of different public series in the last 1 year. Everything from the topics such as social policy to taxation to the fate of the Roma community in Hungary to trade unions. I can't remember all of them, but all different kinds of topics. And today, this is the first one we're doing in English, all the other ones we've done in Hungarian previously, but today it's a special occasion because we have somebody from outside of Hungary. He's Thomas Fazi. Let me introduce the author to you. He is the author of this book that he has. Can you wave the book a bit so that they see it? Yes, it's called Reclaiming the State. And what we will do is that we'll have a first hour which we will spend discussing your book. I will ask you to, at the beginning, say a few words about how this book came about, why you thought you should write it, what it says, what the most strongest message of the book is. And then we have two discussants here. Let me welcome former Commissioner László Andor and Professor from the University of Oxford, Péter Róna, both of them economists. The book is not only about economics, although Thomas is very interested in economics, and in the second part we'll be talking more in depth about the Eurozone, so his main focus, I would say, and his main interest is economics, but it's not simply about economics, it's also about the powers of the state, etc., but he will explain it more than I can. So what we will do, I'll give him the floor first. He'll say a few words about why he wrote the book, what the book is about, etc. Then I will ask the two gentlemen to comment on this, and then we will open up for some questions from those of you who have shown up, and we are very grateful that you have made the time to come here today and you're interested in these topics. And then after about an hour, we switch over more into an in-depth discussion of the Eurozone. So I would like to ask you in the first hour if you could concentrate on the non-Eurozone part of it. Yeah, so everything except for the Eurozone, because we'll save that for the second half. I don't know if we can manage to do that because the Eurozone is really, really important. But let's try to. I think Thomas will give you a lot of kind of inputs to talk about the state and the powers of the state and what the state can do and cannot do in a globalized world. So I would like us to focus in the first half more about the capacities of the state, what it is that the state can or cannot do, and on the content of his book. And then in the second half, we will have more time and opportunity involving the audience, of course, to talk more about economics and the Eurozone. So if that's all fine with you, if nobody has any questions, we will finish around 1 o'clock. Peter, we have to leave at around 1 o'clock, so we plan to finish on time at around 1 o'clock. If there are no questions to begin with, I hand over to Thomas, and I'd like you to please sort of introduce your book.
Okay, well, thank you, Zoltan.
Just keep in mind that that's a microphone, yes?
Okay.
So try to speak close, because we are recording the event, and that white thing is a microphone. So.
Okay. And thanks to Tech and to Mr. Rona and Mr. Andor for participating in this event. So, how did the book come about? So, the book is a result of a series of discussions that me and an Australian economist called Bill Mitchell had while I was doing some work in Australia, where he works in Newcastle. He invited me to do some research on the Eurozone crisis at his research centre in Newcastle in New South Wales in Australia. And while we were doing that work, we were also having a lot of coffees and a lot of discussions. And one of the topics that often came up in our discussions was the decline of the political left in Western countries. So Western Europe, but Western countries more in general, so including Australia and America. As you know, over the past 30 years, left-wing parties, Labour parties, social democratic parties the support for these parties has been collapsing, and today stands at a historical low. In a number of countries, especially in Europe, social democratic parties, Labour parties have essentially been almost wiped out, I would say. And election after election, they keep losing, in most countries, more and more support. So we saw that in the recent French elections, in the recent Dutch elections, and I know the Social Democratic Party isn't doing that well even here in Hungary, although maybe for different reasons, or maybe not so much for different reasons, from why this is happening in sort of Western countries. And so we started analyzing. So I mean, superficially speaking, it's quite obvious, I would say, why left-wing and social democratic parties have been losing consensus. And that is that essentially they have become increasingly similar to traditionally more conservative right-wing parties. And so, especially on economic and social issues. So you will see that, for example, so right-wing conservative parties and sort of social democratic parties have very different opinions when it comes to civil liberties, so gay marriages and stuff like that. But when it comes to economic and social issues, they tend to be increasingly indistinguishable, I would say, in a number of countries. And that's because social democratic parties have essentially sort of accepted the neoliberal economic consensus. So I would say that now there's sort of a cross-party economic consensus in most countries, where in most countries you have sort of a large centre-right party and a large centre-left party. And I would say that, on economic terms, those parties have become increasingly indistinguishable. And so, of course, and so a lot of voters, so traditionally left voters, but even ordinary voters, don't see what these parties can give them in economic and social terms, and so they tend to move away from these parties, and so I think it's quite obvious that this is sort of the, I would say, proximate cause for the decline of social democratic parties. They've turned neoliberal, and so have no true alternative to offer to their sort of right-wing counterparts on major economic issues. But so this is quite obvious, but then we have to ask ourselves why this has happened. Why have traditional left parties moved increasingly to the right on economic issues? And so this is what we wanted to look at in this book, and what we started discussing. And so we started looking at certain sort of historical turning points. So moments in history, when left-wing parties that were in government over the course of the past 30, 40 years were faced with sort of a choice. History often puts, governments and parties in front of a crossroad. And so we looked at those moments in history when faced with these choices. Labour, left-wing governments sort of chose to go down the neoliberal path, down the sort of more right-wing path, rather than staying on the more social democratic path. And so we analysed various historical turning points from the late 1960s to today, and what emerges from our analysis, and of course, what these historical, every turning point after another, these parties have moved more and more to the right, and so in a way, this is these historical turning points are what have led these parties to where they are today, and if you look at these turning points, I think you can see that there's sort of a red line that connects a lot of these events, and this is that from the sort of essentially the 1970s onwards, you see a radical shift in the way left-wing and social democratic parties start to think about the role of the state in relation to markets, the role of the state in relation to globalization, And essentially, you see a new consensus emerging from the late 1970s onwards, which essentially states that the sort of increasingly globalized economy that you start seeing in the 1970s, the increasing internationalization of finance, even the increasing power of multinational corporations, which was a big topic of debate in the 1960s and 70s. So this consensus starts emerging even on the left, that what this process means is that essentially nation states, national governments were becoming increasingly powerless to face the sort of forces of the economy, to manage their national economies. And so this consensus set in that globalization was essentially undermining national sovereignty and the economic sovereignty of nation states. And in fact, so whenever these governments, so for example, the James Callaghan government in the UK in the mid-1970s, or the Francois Mitterrand socialist government in the early 1980s in France, whenever these governments were faced with external and internal pressures, and were finding it increasingly hard to sort of maintain the sort of post-war Keynesian consensus, essentially they accepted that what these pressures meant was that policies that were possible in the past, so kind of pro-labor, social democratic policies, in this new world that was emerging in the 1970s and early 1980s, were no longer possible. And so essentially countries had no choice but to give in to this new, at the time, monetarist consensus in economics, and then what went on to become sort of the neoliberal consensus. And what we show in the book is that, in fact, at each of these turning points, it's not entirely true that there wasn't an alternative. So all the sort of the message that was put out by all these governments at the time was, there is no alternative. In fact, the phrase "there is no alternative" is often attributed to Margaret Thatcher, but in fact, I would say was really introduced by James Callaghan, who was the Labour Prime Minister before in the mid-1970s, and he was the one that in 1976 stood up in front of a very big national Labour Party conference and essentially made what is considered a historical speech in terms of its consequences, where he essentially said, look, the world is changing, Keynesianism is dead, we have to accept that what worked in the past doesn't work anymore. And he literally said the phrase, there is no alternative. And so in fact what you see is that this notion that there was no alternative at the time was very strong among left-wing parties. And so what we show is that in fact there were alternatives at each of these turning points. It is not true that governments had no choice but to sort of accept the dismantling of the post-war economic sort of arrangement. But instead, so what happens in fact is so what you see is kind of a self-fulfilling narrative. So by sort of appealing to the fact that nation states were losing their power in the global economy, governments essentially started what we say in the book, voluntarily reducing the power and the capacity of governments to intervene in the economy, thus effectively reducing the power of nation states. But what we show in the book is that this is was as much an outcome, if not more an outcome, of voluntary decisions that were taken by national elites at the time in a number of countries, rather than kind of the inevitable outcome of the external pressures of globalization. And so what you see from the 1970s onwards is an effect that all the traditional sort of Keynesian instruments of intervention in the economy that most Western countries had from the sort of post-war period onwards start to be dismantled. And so you start to see the creation of independent central banks, or formally independent central banks from the Treasury. You start to see much more tight fiscal policies. You start to see the abolishment of capital controls And so all the instruments that up to the 1970s had allowed governments to sort of, intervene in the economy were slowly dismantled, effectively reducing the capacity of governments to then intervene in the economy and sort of shape the direction of the economy. And I think, and it's interesting that most of this transition to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is usually associated with the governments of Thatcher and Reagan. Of course, Thatcher and Reagan played a huge role in ideologically justifying neoliberalism. But in fact, if you look at the actual policies and the actual transition to neoliberalism, in a number of countries, that transition was effectively enacted by social democratic governments, not so much right-wing governments. So in my country, Italy, pretty much all the neoliberal reforms from the sort of 1980s onwards were pretty much all done by social democratic governments, not Christian Democrat governments or right-wing governments. And I think if you think about it, it's also understandable why this is the case. So, of course, if you're a left-wing party and you start to increasingly accept the notion that the survival of capitalism essentially depends on embracing this new paradigm, this new neoliberal paradigm, then it also makes sense for you to think that it's better if you, as a leftist, manage this transition rather than letting your political enemy manage this transition, because you can do it, in a more, sort of socially, in a less socially harmful way, and so on.
Neoliberalism with a human face.
Neoliberalism with a human face, and this is, in fact, the famous third way, Tony Blair, and so on, and of course. So there was a theoretical problem. I think a lot of the left, I think the intellectual left, the cultural left, and the political left, really, I think, not all of them, but sort of majority of these of the left-wing parties, really, I think, failed to understand what was happening. I think in the 1970s. They really failed to understand what were the true causes, for example, of the crisis of the Keynesian system. So there were also, I think, a lot of Keynesian economists, left-wing economists, were essentially caught off guard. When you had this, famous stagflation of the 1970s, where you had, high unemployment and high inflation, a lot of economists, were essentially caught off guard because Keynesian theory, said that this couldn't happen, that there was always a trade-off between employment and inflation, and you can't have high unemployment and high inflation. That doesn't make any sense. And so, so they really started to really seriously call into question everything they believed in until that time. And when in fact, there were rational explanations for why this was happening. And so essentially what we show is that, there are many explanations for why the Keynesian system broke down. So you have sort of idealistic explanations, which essentially say that this new neoliberal ideology emerged in the 1970s and simply supplanted Keynesian ideology because it was a more convincing ideology and so on. Then you have sort of an almost like conspiracy-like explanation for neoliberalism, which is very, very popular among the left, where it was essentially a conspiracy where, rich people and, oligarchs and technocrats got together in a room and decided to kind of overthrow the sort of existing Keynesian system. So, a very sort of simplistic account of why, of how neoliberalism came about. You also have sort of a structural explanation, which is popular among Marxists, which say, Keynesianism was destined to fail, like all capitalist systems are destined to fail, and so they're really, and so Marxists kind of share the idea that there was no alternative to neoliberalism because capitalism suffers from intrinsic deficiencies, which essentially meant that was the only way for capitalism to survive, to transition to neoliberalism. And instead in the book we say instead that it's a mixture of all these elements. So all these elements played a role, but So the Keynesian system was facing was facing serious structural problems in the 1970s. But the idea that, the only alternative that was available at the time was neoliberalism is not true. We showed that there were alternatives, and that the same is true today. So all those ideas that that started emerging in the 1970s are still very very strong today, especially in the European context. And I'll try to sum up here and leave the word to the other speakers. But in a European context today, there's a very strong consensus that the main justification, or one of the main justifications for European economic and monetary integration, is that essentially national states are have becoming almost, I would say, totally powerless in this increasingly complex, interdependent global economy where you have these huge powers, the United States, China, and so you often hear this argument, but where can if we take the Eurozone and debates about whether countries should return to national currencies or not. So the argument you always hear, for example, is, but where is Italy expected to go by itself in this global world? This tiny little country, even less so Greece or Spain. And so this idea that even what are in effect among the most powerful economies in the world. Italy, for all its problems, is still among the top 10, 15 economies in the world. But still, this idea in Italy, especially, is deeply rooted that we would have absolutely no hope of surviving outside of the monetary union, with our own currency. And so these ideas are still very strong today. And so what we try to do in the book is essentially to offer an alternative explanation to show that, in effect, we say it's not true that nation states today have become powerless. It's not true that globalization means that governments have to cede as much cede decision-making prerogatives to supranational and international organizations such as the European Union and European Monetary Union. We show that it's not true that neoliberalism, has entailed a sort of an erosion, almost an evaporation of the state in favor of the market. This is another argument that's very strong today, that what neoliberalism means is that states have essentially been overpowered by markets, and that now markets and capital markets and private markets and large multinational corporations essentially operate above states. And so how are individual states expected to face up to these massive transnational powers that transcend national borders? And in fact, what we show in the book is that that's only partially true. Neoliberalism still depends very heavily on state intervention. So it's not true that this idea that you have the state versus the market. It's not true. Today, neoliberalism heavily depends on the state for the implementation of, if you think of what neoliberal policies have entailed and entail today, deregulation of labor markets, deregulation of financial markets, free trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements between states, and a whole series of other policies that we associate with neoliberalism would not be possible if there were not states to implement them. And this is just as true in the Eurozone. So the Eurozone is considered to be this, ordo-liberal construct, where you have a sort of apolitical institutions, the European Central Bank and so on, which essentially limit themselves to creating the conditions within which markets can operate, but then, should not intervene in the economy and do not intervene in the economy. Now, some people, so sort of neoliberal economists say this is a good system. Left-wing economists criticize this system, but most people agree on the notion that that there is very little sort of state intervention in the economy in the Eurozone. But even in the Eurozone, we see that is not the case. Think, for example, of the European Central Bank's policies. The European Central Bank has effectively become, an almost unelected government for the Eurozone. It has essentially propped up financial markets for the past, 7, 8 years. So what you have is, this notion that financial markets rule over governments, another very strong argument you constantly hear, especially on the left. But actually it's not true. Today it's actually the opposite. Today financial governments are essentially dependent on constant and permanent central bank support simply to survive. And so we offer, a number of arguments in the book. So this is kind of the analytical part, and then we make some proposals, and here I close. And so we essentially argue that, the shift to supranationalism, to supranational institutions, it makes sense for some aspects to manage some aspects of the international system. Migration, climate change, these are issues that have to necessarily be resolved at the international and supranational level, and we totally agree with that. But we argue that in the context especially of the Eurozone, the transfer of economic decision-making to supranational organizations, the creation of the Eurozone, well, that has in effect had a disastrous consequence, a disastrous effect on a number of countries, and does not really justify the argument for economic supranationalism, for currency supranationalism. And so, we show that in fact for a number of countries in the Eurozone, it would be the only way to sort of regain a path of sustainable long-term growth is in effect, to leave the Eurozone. That within the context of the Eurozone, for some countries, it will be essentially impossible to regain a path of sustainable growth, of sustainable employment growth. We talk about all the proposals for Eurozone reform that that are constantly debated about, maybe not so much in Hungary, but constantly debated about within Eurozone member states. There's hundreds of proposals to make the Eurozone sustainable, to make it workable, to make it work in the interest of periphery countries and not just of core countries. But what we say is that these proposals are all technically, very good. They would work in purely theoretical terms, but we think that the political conditions for a sustainable reform of the Eurozone don't exist and won't exist for the foreseeable future. And I think that's something that we have to take into account when we consider what options are available to countries that today face stagnation, recession, and mass unemployment, and have no and cannot expect to emerge from that situation, according to official economic estimates, for the following 1-2 decades. I think when Greece is told when the IMF and the European Commission estimate that Greece is expected to remain in a context of extreme high unemployment. We're talking, 15, 20% unemployment, 50% youth unemployment. When a country is told this is what you will be facing for the following 10, 15, 20 years, then I think it's totally legitimate to question whether being in that monetary system is in that country's economic interest or not.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas, for that. I think it was an excellent summary and a good provocation for the debate. I'm going to hand over to the two professors here. Before I do that, I would like to thank a couple of organizers who have made this event possible today. I want to thank the Specialized College for Social Theory for organizing this here in Budapest. I want to thank the László College for hosting us. I would like to thank the Untitled Chapter, which was generous in financing our series, the whole public lecture series. And I'd like to thank the University of Sopron, which made Thomas's travels possible. This is actually a series that we did on Tuesday. We were on Monday we were in Sopron, on Tuesday we were in Bratislava, on Thursday we were in Vienna, and today we are in Budapest. So we're basically traveling Central Europe with Thomas and speaking about the Eurozone. So that was a good introduction. I want to turn over for a while to the two professors and then open up to the audience. I want to first turn to László Andor, and your life story in this respect is very interesting because you're very critical often of neoliberalism, but at the same time you spent quite a bit of your life as a commissioner, which is a supranational organization, so you have the experience of how it is from how this is seen from Brussels. I'm very curious, actually, having listened to Thomas, what your reflections are on the possibilities of reclaiming the state.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I think this is a very important debate. It's about 30 years late in this place, and in fact, I'm grateful for the hosts and the organizers because we were having these discussions when I was a student, and it's exactly 30 years ago. And like László, Szakkollégium itself, in a way, is hugely responsible for creating a neoliberal hegemony in Hungary. We did our best. We were weak, and we were unable to convince them that this is going to be a wrong path. But we can restart this discussion, of course, because in the introduction of Thomas, the evidence brought up about economic theory, economic policy brings us back to the 1970s and the 80s. So the topics already were on the table when I was a student, and we were indeed, as Zoltán referred to this, heavily discussing these issues at the time. But I must say that some people just didn't want to listen. And I think sometimes when a conviction is emerging, people sometimes just tend to stick to a position in order to kind of maintain some kind of integrity, even if it's against the evidence. But exactly because of the impact in Eastern Europe, which was not mentioned in the introduction at least, gave an additional lifeline to neoliberalism. At a time when it was already failing at many places, especially the UK, the fact that neoliberal ideology penetrated the Eastern Bloc and these transforming countries, not only absorbed and elevated, but sometimes took it to further extremes. And that was recycled also into the Western debate. It also strengthened the feeling that there is actually no alternative. So it's not only that there is no alternative inside the UK or there is no alternative in the European Union, but there is no alternative in the world, because the system which was trying to be most statist, and it was, badly failed. And of course it badly failed. I think there is a lot of evidence that the Eastern Bloc, as it was functioning at that time, badly failed. There can be a discussion, maybe a separate one, about what were the actual causes of the failure of the Soviet-type economy, which even in more reformed versions went to a decline, although there were some other types of reforms, looking at China, which went through a different line. China actually produced a kind of statist version of managed state capitalism, and a completely different way out of the communist experiment. Now, I think we have several connecting discussions here, one on economic theory, one on economic policy, and then another one on political history. Because in the introduction we also heard about the way social democracy shifted towards the neoliberal so-called consensus, and how it eventually resulted in the collapse of many social democratic parties in Europe. This would be a very long discussion because we would need to go, country by country, election by election, and there would be a need for a lot of details. Let me highlight one issue which I think requires a bit more subtlety, which is the impact of the British case on the continent. I think the impact on the British case, impact of the British case on the continent, is not automatic and not obvious at all. The fact that Jim Callaghan makes a speech in 1976 is a British issue. It doesn't necessarily create a sea change in social democratic thinking either on the continent or even in Britain. This is still followed by years when the British Labour Party is actually agonizing on policy, agonizing on politics, and even splits. And it goes in, the first election under Margaret Thatcher publishes a manifesto, which today they call it the longest suicide note in history, but which was actually an attempt to return to the conventional Keynesian policies with a strong role of the state in it. So, from this point of view, I think it requires a more subtle analysis. What kind of experience pushes certain social democratic parties, and indeed that was already only happening under Neil Kinnock, when they had a broader policy review and concluded that Thatcherism created a new status quo. It may be failing because it created a lot more inflation, a lot more unemployment, a lot more poverty, a lot more domestic imbalances.
High deficits.
So, exactly. So, unfortunately, we didn't elaborate on how the failure of neoliberalism manifests itself. This is very important before asking whether there is an alternative. We need to describe what exactly the record is. And we have a very bad record. In this country, there is this myth that Margaret Thatcher sorted out the British economic problem. She didn't. She aggravated the problems, and then she even arrived to a point when, on these issues of economic doctrine, it was more acceptable for the conservative British government to create a big divide between the UK and the continent, because she wanted to remain neoliberal, as opposed to Jacques Delors, the architect of the European Union, who thought that the European single market can only function with strong regional policy and a strong social dimension. And that's when I think we have a second chapter in the discussion, because I think the continent actually rejects the Thatcherite model. The continent accepts a German model of the social market economy, which is a lot more statist, has a lot more industrial policy, has development banks like the KfW with much greater role for tripartism and not only state intervention but social dialogue and the involvement of the employees and their organizations in decision making. So much of the continent is looking at the German model rather than the British model as a more attractive point. Now, what is causing the problem at the same time? In my view, it's fundamentally the monetary union. If Zoltan is asking us to delay the discussion on the monetary union, I'm in trouble now. Because
no, just say whatever you think. You don't feel constrained.
Because the fundamental problem is that the monetary union in the early 1990s is emerging as a political compromise. It's practically forced upon Germany in order to abolish the Deutschmark for political reasons. The member states, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, they simply want to avoid a too large Germany in the middle of Europe, which through the Bundesbank, through the Deutschmark, is exercising endless economic and political hegemony in Europe. So the creation of the euro is fundamentally a political decision at this time, although it is true that various forms of monetary cooperation since the breakdown of Bretton Woods existed in Western Europe as well. But the point is that Europe could have stayed, and even the single market could have stayed at the stage when there is a single market among the 12, then 15 member states of the EU, but with national currencies. In my view, there was absolutely no necessity to go into. Sorry about it. This is British Telecom. I have to set my password, and I'm risking losing my password. So there is a decision taken at that time to make Germany accept a single currency, but in exchange, it is Germany which is setting the conditions. So Germany accepts the single currency, but it accepts it under certain rules, which prevent the community to transfer fiscal burden from one country to another, right? So this is in a way the social contract underlying the Maastricht model, which I think we would agree creates a non-functional or a dysfunctional monetary union. When the weather is good, when there is growth in all member states of the European Union, these flaws of the Maastricht system do not reveal themselves very easily. But when a crisis comes, when member states would need to rely on instruments which they conventionally relied on when there was an economic downturn, there is a problem, and there is a big problem. And that brought the single currency very close to disintegration in the period 2011 and 12. But then there was a U-turn. And with the entree of Mario Draghi, with the four presidents' report, with the blueprint of the Commission, there is, in a way, a sudden revelation that, by the way, this is not a complete monetary union. The banking union is missing, fiscal union is missing, political union is missing. So we need to change the direction and start moving that way. And the banking union is launched first with 3 pillars, out of which the third one is still outstanding, and a lot of discussions on fiscal burden sharing and the fiscal capacity for the Eurozone. This is, I would say, a very, very slow process, primarily because the political elites of the surplus countries cannot sell it to their domestic audience. What would be needed for a sustainable monetary union? The latest evidence about this is the breakdown of the so-called Jamaica coalition, in which, because of arithmetic, the Free Democratic Party would have been needed in order to have a majority for a new government, and this Free Democratic Party, at least its leader, doesn't want to accept fiscal risk sharing, so the coalition actually broke down. Now, I think we know that this is a highly imperfect monetary union. Indeed, for some of the periphery countries, this is creating a completely unsustainable situation. So they would need to go either further or backwards. What is interesting is that despite all this pain which they were going through, they insist on being part of the monetary union. So if you look at the Greek public opinion, because they had this debate, they have had this debate, and in 2015 they were offered a sugared option to leave the euro area. The majority of the people and the majority of the Syriza party wanted to stay in the monetary union. There were very bright economists, Kostas Lapavitsas in particular, who tried to convince the Greeks that you would be better outside the Eurozone, but since they were unable to explain how long a further recession would last and what kind of additional costs this would take, the Greeks said, okay, we already know what is the life inside, and they were sticking to this. So, and now, if you not only look at the deepest crisis countries like Greece, but the Eurozone in general, there have been a recovery in the last 3 years. It's not very impressive, but some kind of recovery. There is now job growth in the last 3 years overall. So there is, in a way, a feeling among the decision makers that even if it's imperfect and it's very slow reform which is taking place, it is manageable. It is manageable. So it is discouraging a lot of people from thinking about fundamental alternatives to the current system, while I think it is, of course, justified to think about systemic alternatives, because if this reform cannot produce better safety nets until the next crisis comes, of course, it will be more justified to dismantle the single currency and then go back to some different form of monetary system. Just one point, if I may, finally. I think this is a slightly separate discussion from the role of the state in general. There is a monetary debate about the form of the monetary union and monetary cooperation. But at the same time, if you look at the European countries and more widely, there are great varieties between what kind of capitalist system is working. So the Swedish model is not the same as the Portuguese. Italy is not the same as the Netherlands. So membership in the European Union, from this point of view, doesn't prejudge how much redistribution the countries have, and there are countries with very high redistribution rates, very progressive income taxing, development banks, and various forms of industrial policy. So it's the EU membership still leaves a huge amount of choice where you want to belong, and what is your preferred model of business or model of social welfare.
EU or Eurozone? Or
the European Union, what I said. And at this stage, since the great financial crisis, again, there have been very good cycles of moving away from what you call the neoliberal consensus. I don't think there is a neoliberal consensus now. There are many authors, Mazzucato, the latest probably, who are a lot more convincing and a lot more popular than those who would like to look back to the late 70s, early 80s hegemony of Friedman and Hayek, and yes, there's probably a lot more debate internationally than inside Hungary.
Okay, thank you very much, László. Professor Péter Róna of Oxford University is also someone who is well known in Hungary for having A, criticized neoliberalism, and B, criticized the structure of the Eurozone, the way the Eurozone is set up. I have had many discussions with him over the years, but we've never discussed state capacity, so I actually have no idea what he thinks about whether states have any power in the globalized world or not. So I'm very, very curious what he thinks about them.
Right. Let me just start off by observing that my approach, my take on this issue is rather different from the ones that we have just heard. What we have heard is basically economic policy, political approach to the question. Mine is a cultural one. What I'm going to say is that there has taken place a quite profound transformation in the conception of the economic actor in the life of the West, of the industrialized world. Let me start off by clarifying some basic definitional issues or conceptual issues. Neoliberalism is not newborn liberalism. There's nothing neo about it. It is profoundly and radically different from classical liberalism. The fundamental organizing metaphor of classical liberalism is the market. And the market, which is to a variety of processes, natural processes, is able to achieve a state of equilibrium. So the great classical economic liberal concept is market equilibrium, where the players are more or less equal and they are engaged in the fundamental economic activity, which is exchange. In the eternal words of Adam Smith, it rests on the human propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. That is classic liberalism. Neoliberalism is not about that at all. It is about capital. Neoliberalism's central metaphor and organizing concept is the fundamental organizational role in the formation of society of capital. Society must be organized. Human beings must be reformed. They must be measured. They must be trained to satisfy the metrics posed by capital. The hell with free markets. Who cares about free markets? Free markets is a nice word. It's a nice propaganda issue. The question that we must address is the return on capital and how must society be organized so as to maximize the return on capital. For those of you who are interested in this issue, it was actually probably the first one who raised it was Michel Foucault in the 1970s in a famous series of lectures in the Collège de France. Thereafter, it really champions, a small group of champions were in the United States. They were the radical feminists. And it appeared in its most, I think, loveliest form and the most convincing form in the radical feminist literature of the 80s and 90s with such authors as Judith Butler or Wendy Brown. And then the French rejoined this group after the turn of the century to some extent. So those are the authors that you want to look at if you're interested in that subject. Now, what is the significance of this paradigmatic shift, or what Foucault would call a change in the episteme? Yeah. Well, in classic liberal theory, it is right and appropriate and necessary to focus on how national income is divided between labor and capital. And there is a zone, a range, within which that division ought to stay. If you move too much in the direction of labor, what you get is a reduction in the return on capital. The reduction in return on capital leads to underinvestment. Underinvestment leads to eventually job losses and all kinds of nasty things. If you move too much in the direction of capital, on the other hand, what you get is a loss of purchasing power in the part of labor. Loss of purchasing power in turn leads to loss of growth capacity, and so on and so forth. That you'll find all this in the literature very nicely adumbrated on what the shift in one or the other direction would entail. Now, in this model, the arbiter, the referee between labor and capital was the state. And it was the state's fundamental role, and it was the legitimacy, a condition of the legitimacy of the state, that it was able to keep this division within bounds that corresponded to the social consensus and that corresponded to the appropriate, healthy, acceptable functioning of the economy. Now comes, thanks Hayek, Chicago School, Lucas, Friedman, etc., and says, the role of the state is to disappear, get lost. The role of the state, if it has any role, is to satisfy the requirements of capital and to transform society so as to best meet those conditions and requirements. And the state, and they create a new human being, the Homo economicus. The Homo economicus whose life is consists of responding adequately to this requirement. I mean, even at a place like Oxford, what we are doing as teachers is we are generating in our students human capital. You, my dear fellows here, you're all items of capital. And my responsibility as your teacher, it would be to enhance your value as human capital. And the metric for enhancing your values of human capital essentially is derived from corporate finance. So my educational system and its evaluation, its organization, is essentially derived from the principles of corporate finance. If you look at how academics live today, their work is determined on the basis of quantified impact factors. Impact factors. So corporate finance determines what is an impact and then determines the system by which that impact is measured. Right? And you, if you want to have a career either in the private sector or in the government or in academia, are required to satisfy that metric. It is a mind-boggling total victory. The situation is quite desperate because what is at stake is not just what we have been heretofore talking about, but we are talking about the essential nature of the human being. That's at stake. And the human being now has a new rival, which is a robot. And the metric system with which that human being's life is evaluated gets a further reinforcement from the comparison with the capabilities and the functioning of the robot. So it becomes, you see, a quantified metric system, as I say, derived from corporate finance. In this struggle, in this refereeing between labor and capital, the state loses out. Essentially, it is no longer able to perform this function. It is no longer able to counterpose to this new idea of the Homo economicus, to counterpose anything to it. It is not a question, and here I disagree with you, of choices having been mistaken by the Social Democrats and so on. It is a question of the rise of an entirely new paradigm of what human life is about. Now, in this process, the peripheral countries such as Hungary are particularly vulnerable because their role becomes one of essentially supplying cheap labor to the requirements of capital. And this government and its predecessor, the last 25 years of Hungarian politics, has, with great alacrity, fulfilled this expectation. Its educational policies, its economic policies are essentially devoted to the requirements of capital. I don't see a way out in a sense of, well, let's reconsider what options the Social Democrats messed up or missed out on, and let's revisit that issue and see if we can make some different choices. The way out, if there is one, is smashing this paradigm. Intellectually and culturally smashing this paradigm. Not very likely, not impossible, but not immediately likely. A more likely situation is that the division in society, the polarization of society, will lead to revolution, will lead to disorder. So the real end of neoliberalism is going to be violence. It's going to be a violent end. It's quite illusory to imagine that the political powers, the EU, who made themselves look rather silly the other day in Göteborg, has the capacity to bring about any fundamental change in this paradigm. The paradigm is immensely powerful, and it is quite illusory to imagine that through peaceful political activity functions and can be effective within the context of an existing paradigm. But the existing paradigm is the power of capital. So its replacement is not an easy task, a very profoundly difficult task. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. Now, as far as the euro is concerned, I entirely agree. What is, in that connection, let me just make another point. Somewhere around 1941, Hayek wrote an article in the American periodical called The Commonwealth, which people don't very much quote. I looked up how often it has been referred to, and so not very much. It seems to be rather obscure, but it's a very important article. At that time, in the United States, people were talking about what will happen when we win the war. What will happen to Europe, what will happen to the Middle East, what will happen to so on and so forth. And Hayek came out with this article saying that he was very much in favor of a European Union, and explained why he was so gobsmacked with the idea of a European Union, why he was so enthusiastic about it. He says, well, you see, what happens in the case of a union is that the means, the tools, the policy tools that are available to a sovereign national government are wholly or partly transferred to this new union. And therefore, the sovereign states no longer have the full scale of policy tools with which to manage their societies. But, and this is what he likes so much here, the union is unable to exercise these. So what really happens, and this is why he's so attracted to the European Union, is that the tools available to government are seriously diminished. It just has so many fewer tools with which it can respond to a given situation. Now, the classic extreme example of this phenomenon is the euro. The euro takes away virtually all of monetary policy from the member countries and seriously diminishes fiscal room. Well, where does the monetary policy tool, spectrum of monetary policy tools go, and what happens to the fiscal policy alternatives that have been taken away? Well, a bit of it ends up in Frankfurt with the European Central Bank, but certainly by no means the full scale of traditional national central bank monetary tools. Just as you said, the bank union reform is still very far away from completion. The supervision of financial institutions was clearly well within the power of national governments. No question about it. Central banks had immense influence on how the financial institutions of a country are governed. There's no mucking about. What they said should be was what happened. Right? Well, it ain't so anymore. They cannot tell the banks operating within their jurisdictions, this foreign currency loan business, or devizahitelezés, it's a stupid idea. Forget it. Just don't do it, okay? Forget it. No, they can't tell. And if they try to tell the banks say, who are you to tell me? You don't have the authority to tell me. Forget it. Especially if they are within the Eurozone, but even outside it. They don't have the power. So the power of the state to employ what were traditional economic policy tools, both on the monetary side and the fiscal side, have been very seriously reduced. Instead, what has not been reduced are the powers and the tools designed to protect capital. So all of the reduction that has taken place was at the expense of labor, because all of the remaining tools that are lodged with the central bank are designed to be so-called anti-inflationary. The whole structure of the Maastricht criteria is about the protection of capital. There is nothing in Maastricht that talks about the protection of labor or of society. There is nothing in the whole edifice of the European Union that is about the protection of labor. Zero.
This is not true.
It's true.
It is not true.
Well, you explain why it's not
I
true.
will explain, but I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have to.
Yeah.
We should say what is true.
Yeah, I should say what is true, and you will say what is true, and I'll say what is true. All right. We'll agree. All right. There is no common code of labor law. All right? There is no common standard for the employment of people. There is no common budgetary or social policy for the correction of cyclical or other asymmetrical disturbances. Now you say, and you will say, that the European Union has a labor. It's a joke. When an asymmetrical shock happens, as it happened in 2008, where was the European Union's labor policy toolkit with which the resulting asymmetrical shocks could be contained or corrected or mitigated? Nowhere. And since 2008, there has been one thing on the table and one thing only: how to protect the financial system from the consequences of that shock. Period. Now you go ahead and you tell me what the...
Yes, no, I think the mistake you're making is not to distinguish between the European Union and the currency union. As I explained, and if needed, I will explain further, when the European Union is created, there is a serious construction of a social dimension for a European single market without a currency union. In a way, there is no common labor code, but there's a lot of labor legislation protecting the working time, protecting the health and safety of the workers, in order to avoid social dumping and in order to avoid a race to the bottom. This exists. You cannot say it doesn't exist. The problem is what you highlighted, on the other hand, that in connection with the monetary union, you have the asymmetric shocks, and there is nothing to replace the capacity to adjust exchange rates. This is the problem. And this is the problem of the South and the periphery in general. You can protect the working time, which the European Union continues to do, but at the time of the crisis, the problem is not about the protection of the working time, but about contributing with demand to the peripheral regions where there is an asymmetric shock. This is the lacking aspect. And
if I may say so, that's no small matter.
Sorry,
that's not.
I agree,
matter.
but look, you don't need to convince me, because I was the one to come forward with the concept of the European Union unemployment insurance scheme. So this is not about protection of the banks, by the way. This is a protection of Germany. This is a protection of the countries which refuse transfers, because anything which you say and I say, and we agree on this, would only function if there are cross-country transfers.
Right.
This is the problem. Right. That some countries insist that the currency union should be sustained without establishing transfer mechanism.
Right. So there are. We agree that the European Union has taken measures to protect labor.
Otherwise, it would not exist.
Which are, however, in my book, wholly inadequate.
Yes, exactly.
Wholly inadequate.
Inadequate if there is a monetary union.
No. There was Hungary is not a member of the monetary union, and the asymmetric shocks of 2008 affected Hungary as much as any monetary union member. So the distinction between monetary union member and EU member is not a meaningful distinction.
Hungary is part of the monetary union, just not part of the single currency zone.
Oh well, then who is not a part of the monetary union in the EU?
Everybody is part. Even the UK is part of the monetary union.
Then what are we arguing about? The point is that the European Union, within the Eurozone and outside the Eurozone, never mind, doesn't make a difference, is unable to protect the economies of Europe against asymmetric shocks.
That's the point.
Or any other shock, even symmetrical ones. Now, if we want to talk about the euro a bit, you see that the fundamental pro-capital bias of the system, and explicitly an extreme form of the currency union, is that it regulates matters that could have an adverse effect on capital, but it does absolutely nothing to regulate matters that could have an adverse effect on labor. So, if Germany accumulates, if Greece, Italy, whoever, accumulates significant deficits, the whip comes out, the fines, the punishment, the work, that you must not do that. When, on the other hand, another country, Germany, accumulates substantial surpluses with which it takes away demand from the peripheral countries, trade surplus, right? Nothing happens. There is no punishment. There is nothing in the European Union that says, well, if you have such a surplus, X percentage of it must be recycled. And if you don't recycle it, we're going to punish you, just like we punish Greece or whoever else for going the other way. So what I talked about, the role of the state in maintaining that relationship between labor and capital, has been totally subverted by the European Union, and within the European Union, most strikingly so by the introduction of the euro. End of speech.
Yeah, can I broaden our debate a little bit? Because I will, in a short while, I will want to open up to the audience. And it's very interesting what you're talking about, but you've really gone to a sort of more in-depth analysis of a certain part of the issue. But I would like to broaden the debate a little bit by kind of listing the problems with the Eurozone, because I'm not sure that many of the students here have actually ever been exposed to critiques of the Eurozone. We tend in Hungary to overestimate the advantages of the Eurozone, which have to do with obviously eliminating exchange rate risk, eliminating conversion costs, creating price transparency, which leads to an increase in trade, and through an increase in trade, there is this expectation that there will be convergence of the output of the living standards of these countries. Thomas was showing a very interesting graph yesterday in Vienna about how there is actually no convergence in the Eurozone. If you take the entire Eurozone, it's pretty much stable, and if you take the original 11, there's massive divergence. Yeah. So this has not come true. For a lot of countries it has been quite bad. For instance, Italy, where Thomas is from, the per capita GDP of Italy today is lower than it was before they had entered the Eurozone. So for a lot of countries, it's not surprising that most of the population are against the Eurozone, and we were concluding in Bratislava and Vienna that this whole Eurozone business is actually blasting apart the entire process of European integration.
Absolutely.
We started after the Second World War with acting against nationalism, going towards some kind of a European integration, which there's a lot of positive impulses in this, and it's with jeopardizing effectively. Now, what are these factors? Because I'm sure a lot of you have never even heard of the critiques of the monetary union as they exist. I'm not going to go into detail. I just want to shortly list a couple of these, and if you like, we can take them one by one, or if you want to take them apart in the question. So a few of these. One of them is this issue that the Eurozone is what we call not an optimal currency area, which has to do with the nominal interest rate. So if you have some countries in the Eurozone which are growing very fast, and you have some other countries which are almost in recession or de facto in recession, you cannot set the right nominal interest rate. There is no way that the central bank in Frankfurt can set the right nominal interest rate for some countries which are growing very fast and other countries that are in a recession. So either you push some countries into a recession by setting the nominal interest rate too high, or you create asset price bubbles by setting the nominal interest rate too low. Obviously, a monetary union cannot have two interest rates. Yeah, it can only have one, otherwise there would be arbitrage. So if you set the nominal interest rate too low, which is effectively what happened in the Eurozone, because they wanted to favor those nations which were effectively in a recession, you create an asset price bubble. And you saw that in Portugal, Spain, Greece, Italy, France, a lot of places. So effectively it was monetary policy. We should never deny that obviously these countries had their own problems. Greece had a corrupt public administration, etc., etc. There are all these local problems as well, but there is a construction fault in the Eurozone because you cannot set the right interest rate. We were blowing a huge asset price bubble, which exploded obviously, and that asset price bubble brought in a lot of imports from Germany, and that's a second problem with the Eurozone, that we have asymmetric economic structures. A lot of these southern European countries deindustrialized, and they're importing from Germany and Northern Europe, which is very export-oriented and it has a huge industrial base. And a lot of countries in the south don't have that industrial base. So there was a massive import from the north to the south. You see the trade balances, and I wish we had a projector here. We had one yesterday in Vienna, where if you look at the trade balances between the Eurozone countries prior to the creation of the Eurozone, it's actually quite balanced. There are hardly any imbalances between Eurozone member states. You introduce the euro, and suddenly Germany develops this massive, massive trade surplus, and almost everybody else develops this massive, massive trade deficit. And that's another structural fault of the Eurozone, which Professor Rona has just alluded to, that there should be a mechanism where at this point the Commission or someone intervenes and says this cannot work. And then there's a third problem, a third structural problem with the Eurozone. I'm really simply just listing, we could go into much more detail, I'm just listing. That has to do with wages, because wage policy in Germany was basically lowering wages within GDP. So basically, as the GDP in Germany was growing, they kept the wages stable, and therefore the wage share of GDP was getting lower and lower and lower. Effectively, Germany was wage competitive. So productivity might have been growing, but there was no relevant increase in wages. While everywhere else, obviously the wages were growing, especially in the south, where you had the asset price bubble. If you have an asset price bubble, you cannot not grow wages. And in the north, specifically in Germany, they were keeping the wages low. Now this cannot work either, unless the Eurozone somehow coordinates wage policy, and this really has to do with trade unions and the entire legislation, wage bargaining, and the whole problematic that Professor Rona has been problematizing here. Unless you coordinate wage policy, or the EU develops some kind of policy on wages, you're unable to set this thing right, because some countries will be price competitive. And Germany became price competitive through being wage competitive, effectively. Now you can say, well, why doesn't everybody act like Germany? And I read this a lot in the Hungarian press. When it's raised that Germany has a massive trade surplus, it's very often raised in the Hungarian press, well, we should all be like Germany. Maybe Germany's doing something right, and we should copy Germany. But in effect, you cannot copy a country like that, because if everybody was restraining wages, there would be no Eurozone. You can't all be exporting and not importing. It's impossible to have a monetary union when everybody's just importing and nobody's importing. Why? Because my exports to you are your imports. It's theoretically impossible for everybody to be just... So that's why you have to balance out the trade, right? So this is a third problem. And then there's a fourth problem, which has to do with how you solve the crisis. I wish once again I had a projector here. Next time I'm definitely going to organize one. The mainstream narrative of the problems with the Eurozone is that it was a problem with what we call sovereign debt, that it was a sovereign debt crisis, which means that the problems with the Eurozone developed because states were overspending. And they were evolving larger and larger debt levels compared to GDP because they were spending too much and not more than their revenues would have allowed them. If you actually look at the figures, if you actually take a look at Eurostat, if you look at the debt levels of these countries that we're talking about during the decades of the Eurozone, the data from Eurostat does not support that. In many countries, in Italy, it was slightly decreasing, the debt to GDP ratio. In Greece, it was stable. In Ireland, it was going down like crazy. The only country that there was a slight increase was Portugal, but nothing really extraordinary. And many of these countries actually had very low levels of debt. So the evidence doesn't support this hypothesis that it was exploding debt during these years by overspending by states. It wasn't a sovereign debt crisis. When does the debt level explode? It explodes once you start the reforms, the treatment, the so-called austerity. Because what does austerity suppose? I mean, the theory of austerity comes from this guy called Alberto Alessina, who is an Italian working in not your fault, working in...
I have to go. Sorry.
Maybe when it's fair.
Yeah.
Maybe when it's fair. By this guy called Alberto Alessina, and believe it or not, the theory of austerity says that the government is restoring confidence in the business community by stabilizing the debt level, by stabilizing the budget deficits, and therefore private businesses invest because they believe that the government will no longer have to, there will be no overspending by the state. Now, have you ever seen a business person, a real business person, who is happy about raising his taxes being raised? And have you ever seen a business person who's happy about her customers losing their jobs? Losing their jobs. Her customer base is losing their jobs. They're being kicked out through austerity, or their wages are frozen. Their taxes are raised, and the business community is supposed to be happy about it, and confidence is restored, and therefore we are investing more during times of austerity. I mean, this is completely contrary to what a real business cycle looks like. Not surprisingly, when they start austerity, debt to GDP levels go up like crazy. Yeah, I'm going to post this figure on Egyenlőség as soon as I can. You'll see the figure. It's completely flat during the Eurozone. It goes up like crazy when the austerity starts. Now, why does debt to GDP go up during austerity? Primarily because GDP collapses. There is no demand in the economy, and this has already been mentioned, that austerity kills demand. There is a massive lack of demand today. That's why we have very low growth. Take the counterexample of China. When the global recession happened in 2008, the Chinese government suddenly injected a massive amount of demand into the Chinese economy, and China continued growing at very high levels. In Europe, this is effectively forbidden. Austerity has been constitutionalized. Fiscal conservatism has been constitutionalized, which effectively bans even mild Keynesian counter-cyclical policy. So the example of Greece shows that the Greek government would have liked, it wasn't a radical left-wing party. I mean, Syriza has been sold in the mainstream Hungarian press as well as a radical left-wing party. There was nothing radically left-wing about Syriza. All they wanted to do was a mild Keynesian left-wing anti-Keynesian policy, which Thomas in his book would have mentioned as what the Social Democrats were doing in the west of Europe in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. It was standard economic practice to do anti-cyclical policy.
Actually, much more moderate than...
Much more moderate than those guys back in the 50s and 60s. This was effectively banned by the European Central Bank, which dried up the liquidity in the Greek banking system and thereby forced the Greek government to accept austerity. So I just wanted to create a list. These are the real issues with the Eurozone. It's you can't set the right interest rate, you don't coordinate wage policy, you develop massive trade imbalances, and nobody's correcting the massive trade imbalances. Although it might seem like a monetary phenomenon, somewhere deep down it's actually a question of economic structure. Yeah. The economic structure of Southern Europe and Northern Europe. So it's the real economy at the bottom of it, while we are talking at the top about monetary policy. Yeah, I just thought that I would be helpful by kind of expanding the debate a little bit, not just focusing, which I agree it's important to talk about labor rights, but to kind of enumerate, because a lot of Hungarian students never get it.
What I think, on reflection, I think that one of the reasons why we have this apparent disagreement is that László is talking about labor rights. I am less concerned with labor rights and more concerned with macroeconomic policies that are pro-labor. And it is the absence of the ability to formulate macroeconomic policies that are helpful to labor that I'm complaining about.
It's very great.
Yeah. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give back the word to Thomas for a brief kind of response to all of what has been raised, and then we open up the floor for questions and comments. Okay.
Bocs, de amíg készülünk egy moderátorral, és azt szeretnénk, hogy...
Persze, jöjj. Persze. Parancs.
So, as the first step to shifting the conversation from more broader debate on the neoliberalism to conversation on specific issues on the EU, I'd like to first turn to Mr. Fazi. In your book, you set out a strategy of privacy politics for the 21st century that kind of eschews the reformation of the EU or considers it illusory. And to quote, the bottom line is that the progressive reform of the EU is not only impossible in practical terms, but also undesirable in popular democratic terms. Could you elaborate on this idea and why do you think it's the case?
Okay, so before I answer you, I just want to comment on a few things that were said, and then I will answer you. So on the question, so the economic problems, I mean, Zoltán gave a perfect, I think, overview of what the economic problems of the Eurozone are. It makes no sense to say whether the Eurozone is a good or bad currency in purely economic terms. It's worked fairly well for some countries, or for the capitalists within that country. But even for, if you look at Germany, it has a very low level of unemployment, even though a lot of those jobs are poorly paid, precarious jobs, but low levels of unemployment. The same goes for a number of countries that are part of the sort of German bloc or German sort of wider supply chain, which also includes a number of Eastern countries. They all enjoy fairly low levels of unemployment and even decent levels of growth. Nothing spectacular, but they're doing okay. So that's one bloc, the sort of German bloc, and then you have the periphery bloc, and particularly the Mediterranean bloc, which instead has fared disastrously, as has been mentioned. I mean, appalling unemployment levels, appalling poverty levels. In many cases, unemployment, poverty, and GDP growth levels that have regressed to levels that were lower than they were before entering the Eurozone. Greece is sort of the quintessential example of this. Greece today has an average unemployment rate of about 20%, as I said, and that's the highest unemployment rate that Greece has had. I've looked at the data that goes as back as the 1960s, and you can't find a time in Greek history where unemployment has been this high. So as a direct result of its Eurozone membership, Greece today has the highest unemployment rate that it's ever had in 50 years. So that's one point. So the question really is, the Eurozone is tailored around a certain economic model, the German export-led low inflation model. So if you're if you have that model already in place, or if you're part of the German supply chain, and so you're also a kind of export-led country because you sell parts to Germany for cars and so on, you can survive within the Eurozone. The problem is, the real problem is for countries that have a radically different economic, although, in particular the countries of the periphery, which historically have always been more internal demand-led economies, higher inflation economies, and so on. So the question is, so if a country is, or if the citizens of a country are wondering whether their country should enter the Eurozone or not, that's obviously, the first thing to look at. What's the economic structure of our economy, and is our economy compatible with the Eurozone's architecture? And I don't know enough about Hungary to say whether that is the case or not. So that's one issue, the economics. But I think it's the politics of the Eurozone and of the EU are as, if not more important than the economic issues. So I completely agree with Professor Rona's assessment of what neoliberalism is. It's a system in which the state essentially becomes, the instrument of capital rather than regulating the labor-capital conflict. And I think the EU and the Eurozone particularly are a perfect example of this. So I'd like to add a few elements of reflection on the EU. So it's been said that, essentially the EU, and particularly the Eurozone, is a system in which national elites have ceded to supranational institutions a whole series of tools of intervention that they previously had. Currency management, monetary policy, fiscal policy, to a large degree, and so on. So of course one may ask him or herself, why would they do this? Why would national elites voluntarily give up, what were, their some of their most essential prerogatives as, the political managers of a nation? It doesn't seem to make much sense at first. And of course, there are a number of reasons why they did this, but there's one, I think, element that one should reflect on, and that is that by ceding power to supranational institutions, you effectively, national elites form national, I would say, economic political elites. In formal terms, they lose power because they can't resort to deficits anymore. I mean, they really have way fewer powers, even to manage political consensus in their countries. But they gain power in another way, and that is that by having the ability to constantly displace the responsibility for unpopular political choices onto international institutions, external institutions, such as the ECB, the European Commission, and so on, is a very powerful tool for all the various national economic political elites themselves to implement policies that they have always wanted to implement, but would have had a much harder time implementing had they been politically responsible for their decisions. I think this is an aspect of how the Eurozone and the European Union works that is often underplayed, but I think it's a crucial aspect of why national elites were willing to cede these powers, is that in a way they gained powers. So if you look at at Italy, for example, by ceding certain powers, by joining the Eurozone, national elites, economic elites, capital, was able to implement policies that would have been almost impossible to implement in political terms outside of the Eurozone. Because of now all they have to do is, if unemployment goes up or whatever, they can simply say, it's not our fault. It's the ECB's fault, it's the European Commission's fault, or simply Europe demands this. Now in Italy, the phrase "ce lo chiede l'Europa," which means Europe demands this, or Europe is asking for this, is so common. It's actually it's entered our pop culture. People joke about it, I don't want to do this, but Europe is asking me to do it. To say how much, how much national elites have used this argument to implement highly antisocial policies. So I think this is one element. In a way, the EMU, the Eurozone, can be considered a very powerful tool in the hands of all national capitals to implement policies that they have always wanted to implement. So that's one point. Then there's another point, and that is that not all states are the same. Not all states are equal. Some states are more equal than others. There's a clear hierarchical relationship of states within the Eurozone. So it's no secret that, Germany, has a great, is not only, Europe's economic powerhouse, but as a result of this also yields, a great political power in the EU for a number of reasons, which, we won't go into details, but, let's take that as a fact, that Germany, is the sort of a dominating power within the Eurozone and the EMU. And in this sense, the Eurozone is also a very powerful tool to implement policies on countries that dare to defy this sort of economic political status quo. So Zoltan was mentioning the Greek example. I mean, I think I'll go over it again just because it really it merits reflection. So you have a government that's elected, Syriza, center-left government that's elected on a sort of anti-austerity platform, tries to, bring an alternative policy program to the European institutions to try to, at least soften the blow of austerity and so on. European institutions, completely refused to even consider Greece's proposals. And at the height of the negotiations, the ECB, the European Central Bank, in a purely political decision, a decision that was not motivated by any financial or monetary considerations, in a purely political decision, decides to shut down the Greek banking system as a way to put pressure on the Greek government and to essentially force it to sign the third bailout, and the new austerity measures that were associated with it. And I think this is really telling of what it means, especially for a weak country, a relatively weak country, to join the Eurozone. It does essentially mean that you are reverting yourself to a kind of neo-colonial status. You're becoming a kind of financial colony of external institutions which can literally impose policies on you, not on your government, but even on the citizens, which of course have elected that government on a certain program. What happened in Greece is that, a central bank used its currency issuing powers to essentially force an elected democratic government to accept the policies that, the central bank and more in general the European institutions believed that Greece should follow. Now just reflect a minute on what this means in democratic terms. I mean, it's not, the problem with the European Central Bank is not just that it's only focused on low inflation and so on, which is a problem, is that it's a central bank unlike any other central bank in the world. It would be unthinkable for any normal central bank to dare to openly defy a government, an elected government, and to even try to remove that government. It would be unthinkable for any normal central bank to do that. And instead that happens, I would say, quite regularly in the Eurozone. Greece is the most obvious example, but in my country we had a similar episode. It's less clear-cut, there's still debates about what exactly happened in 2011 when Silvio Berlusconi was forced to resign and the technocratic government of Mario Monti, former Goldman Sachs man, was brought in. But there's ample evidence, and quite high-level politicians that were in power at the time have come out and said that there essentially was a kind of European conspiracy to use the ECB to put pressure on the Italian government. The message being, if you Silvio Berlusconi don't resign, the ECB is going to stop intervening to support Italian bond prices and Italian banks. There's disagreements about whether this exactly happened or not until but I think there's sufficient evidence to show that this was the case. We have the example of Ireland, 2010, where leaked letters have shown that the ECB and the European Commission basically told the Irish government, either you bail out your banks or we're going to stop supporting your government debt. So there's ample evidence of how essentially the Eurozone, of how the Eurozone essentially means that governments, do essentially revert to a kind of neo-colonial status. So I think the question there is, for any country, wondering whether they should join the Eurozone or not, look at the economic aspects, but look also at the political democratic aspects. You would be entering a system in which effectively, today you think it might be in your interest, tomorrow, for whatever reason, you decide you want to change your policies, you want to break with the European policy status quo, and you would effectively be unable to do it. So your democratic rights would be severely restricted, because you could even elect a government in power that, was in favor of a different policy than the one proposed by the European Union and European Monetary Union, but chances are, you would have no hope of implementing that program, and your government might even be removed, through financial blackmail, or pressured into accepting whatever policy you're proposal through financial blackmail. And I know it sounds like, some kind of sci-fi story, some kind of, Le Carré book, but these are all things that have effectively happened in the past few years in the European Union. I'm not making anything up. So I think there's economic questions to think upon, but even more important political questions to reflect upon. And so this brings me to your question. Can the Eurozone be reformed in a way? So reform of the Eurozone. So making the Eurozone sustainable would mean, from my point of view, would mean making it economically sustainable, but also politically sustainable. So to make it economically sustainable, the Eurozone would effectively have to be transformed into a kind of, a normal federal political union, like, the United States, Australia, or whatever. And that would require a central government, a central treasury with the ability to deficit spend, for example, with the support of the ECB. And not simply to have a small pot of money that it can give around, but it should have the ability to spend in deficit with the ECB directly supporting, this future European government. That's what all normal federations do. You would have to have permanent, I would say semi-permanent, fiscal transfers between countries and regions. I think when the Germans say that they're afraid that a fiscal and political union would bring about permanent fiscal transfers between countries and regions, they're right. I think given the structural differences between countries, that is true. You would effectively have regions and countries that are permanently in surplus, that have an external surplus, and countries that have a sort of almost permanent, I would say, structural deficit. And that is exactly what happens even in the United States. In the United States, you more or less have states that are permanently in deficit and states that are permanently in surplus. So there's permanent fiscal transfers constantly at play within any fiscal union, any real federation. And you would need a whole set of other things. Tax harmonization, labor market harmonization, a whole set of things. And the question is, how realistic is it to expect Germany to accept this? We're talking of a reform that, sort of in very basic terms, sort of Keynesian reform of the Eurozone, which would effectively be, in complete contradiction with Germany's economic model. And so, the question is, why should Germany ever accept that kind of reform? But more in general, even if you think about what that would require, purely in technical terms, you would need treaty change. You would have to change the treaties for this kind of radical institutional reform of the European Union and Eurozone. Changing the treaties essentially, means unanimity of all member states. So you would have to convince all member states that this is the kind of reform that they should all support. So I think it's not hard to see why, people like me and others increasingly believe that, making the Eurozone even just economically sustainable is unrealistic. And, a number of commentators share, and especially people who know Germany and know how Germans think, they will tell you, all German commentators will tell you, it's almost impossible for Germany to accept, a kind of Keynesian radical reform of the Eurozone. That's one point. And then I say, even if that were possible, would it be desirable? Because then you have the issue, okay, we've created a Eurozone government, but how do you make that government democratically accountable? How do you make it? How do you create a government where citizens accept essentially voting once every 4 years, let's say, for the European Parliament, and accepting that is the sovereign entity, and that the decisions that institution makes, have to be accepted as, the sort of common will of the European people. I find that, and setting aside a whole set of other problems, I find that very unlikely. I think it's very hard to imagine that in the real future, the majority of European citizens will come to accept the European Parliament as the main sovereign sort of legislative body, and would accept the European Parliament's decisions as legitimate. And so I think, from my point of view, the conditions just don't exist to make the Eurozone sustainable, neither in economic terms or in political terms. Now, I know a lot of people disagree, but I think at least maybe we should give ourselves a time frame. Like, how much time do we allow ourselves for these reforms to take place before we seriously start taking into consideration other options? I think then maybe that's a point where maybe we can all, people who believe that reform is possible and people that don't believe it's possible can maybe find some agreement. Okay, can we at least agree on a time frame? So let's say, let's give ourselves X, years, to make this happen. After that, we all seriously start to take into consideration, other options, including a reversion to national currencies for some countries. I think we need to be having this debate. I mean, the whole issue of return to national currencies, which does pose huge technical and political difficulties, given the current situation for a number of countries, I think cannot be evaded. It is an option that has to be taken into consideration in the context of a Eurozone that appears increasingly unreformable.
Professor Rona, you're known to be one of the most prominent advocates for a wage union in the European Union here in Hungary. And considering that, could you reflect on what Mr. Fazi just said? Could you imagine a wage union without monetary or fiscal union?
Well, without a monetary or fiscal union, and if there is no monetary and fiscal union, there is no EU. That sooner or later, the absence of a monetary and fiscal union undermines the credibility of the EU. If there is no EU, the whole question of wage convergence acquires an entirely different dimension. It's a different sort of an issue. What my interest in the wage union issue has been is the creation of macroeconomic policy tools with which the European Union is able to bring about convergence. My issue is that the European Union to date has been more an engine of divergence on the whole, and certainly the Eurozone, than of convergence, for the reasons that I explained. The policy tools available for the regulation of economic life in this union are inadequate, simply inadequate. There are things that happen in the ordinary life or economic life of nations, of groups of nations, of areas, geographic areas, that require a much broader, much stronger, much interesting set of policy tools than are currently at the disposal of the European Union. Some people often cite why can't the European Union be like the United States? Well, the United States federal government takes 22% of the GDP as its budget. It's got 22% of ammunition with which it can deploy to deal with asymmetric shocks or any kind of thing. Yeah. The European Union has 1% of GDP available to it for that purpose. That is a joke. That is a joke. I mean, was it McCulloch who wrote that famous report, the Scottish economist in the 80s, I think it was, that said that the beginning number, budget number, for anything meaningful in terms of a labor policy is 5% of Europe's GDP. That we can start about something meaningful with a budget for the European Union equal to 5% of the European Union's total budget. Then you have some tools with which to affect labor disequilibria and similar problems. Under current circumstances, it's not possible. So my interest and my commitment to this issue is that, and the idea that the proportion between labor and capital and the relationship between labor and capital is a profoundly important issue in the life of any community, and it has political dimensions, moral dimensions, economic dimensions, even security dimensions, this set of questions, and that at the moment it is one with which neither the member governments nor the European Union is equipped to deal.
I see. Mr. Andor, the ECB plans to taper down its quantitative easing program from 60 billion euros to 30 billion euros per month. And what effect can it have on Italy or in the poor Eurozone countries, this move?
Well, I think withdrawal from counter-cyclical policy is always linked to the question of timing. How fast you implement a policy like that. How can you ensure that the exit doesn't take prematurely? We have a very bad experience with the ECB, what concerns 2010 and 11. This has not yet been mentioned because we have been focusing on the side of fiscal policy. But the ECB, with the premature exit from the monetary expansion, was also responsible for creating the Eurozone recession in 2010 and 11. So there is a high risk if there is German pressure on Mario Draghi, which there is. There is a risk that this would be premature and then a new recession would be triggered. If Jens Weidmann, as the next ECB president, steps in and he wants to make a quick change, that also is a very high risk for the Eurozone economy. And when we say Eurozone economy, of course, the risk is always greater for the periphery countries. Also, it partly also depends on the rest of the world, what is happening at the same time in the United States, because the United States also made expansion longer in order to avoid triggering a European crash. So there are lots of connections what concerns of monetary policy and liquidity. But I think the ECB so far has been quite consistent. They don't want to rush, and they are right. The question is why they were sadistic against Greece, because that makes it inconsistent. Since Mario Draghi came, he represented an expansionary policy with one exception, 2015 Greece.
And I would
what is the conspiracy behind it?
The conspiracy was to essentially, force Syriza to accept a third bailout.
So why was it necessary for the ECB? Because it was inconsistent with the ECB.
No, because the ECB is not an apolitical institution.
No. It's a different problem. The ECB had to preserve the banking system.
But there wasn't a threat to the banking system.
Yes, it was.
But to preserve the banking system, they should have allowed the emergency liquidity assistance.
You don't save the banking system by trying to destroy it.
Exactly.
I would argue that it was an essentially political decision.
But what is the political logic? What is the
political logic? Is to force Syriza to accept austerity. To accept austerity.
Yeah.
They were asking for more time.
But why is it good? Why is it good for Mario Draghi?
Because I think Mario Draghi is not as apolitical as you
No, he is political, of course.
I think he's intrinsically political, and I think it's not preposterous to imagine that Mario Draghi, as a representative of the European institutions, of the European status quo, had an interest in ensuring that Greece did not defy the status quo.
Absolutely.
And was brought in.
Can I just set out the counter argument, the counter position, because I think it's more complicated than that. The European Union and Mario Draghi in particular was faced with the growing popularity, and now beginning to be endorsed at that time by the IMF, that the genuine solution to the Greek crisis is to write down the debt. Now, that, also in light of the analysis that I set out about the position of capital, was sacrilegious. The idea that some portion of the debt would have to be written down was something that the European Union, especially Germany, at that stage, was quite unwilling to contemplate. Okay? So what they were saying is, look, debt write-down is totally off the table. Forget it. We are just not going to agree to that. And just to make it clear that you get our point of view, here's what we are going to do to you. And that's why they did it. It was to once and for all kill the idea of debt write-down. Now, this is the fundamental problem, fundamental difference in the European attitude about bank regulation and the American one. The Americans had a fantastic crisis in 2007 with the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Huge problem. They closed 338 banks, closed them, wiped out the shareholders. Goodbye. Your bank is not worth anything. We are closed. You are closed. Your shares are worthless. They forced the resignation of over 200 bank CEOs of the ones that were not closed. You're incompetent. Out. And there was substantial debt write-down. So bondholders and shareholders in the American banking system lost hundreds of billions of dollars in the consequence of the crisis. Now, that is something that the European authorities and the EU, because of its structure and because of its very seriousness, is unable to deal with. And also because it doesn't have the 20% of GDP behind its back with which to manage the bank closures, or the Americans were able to do. So that's a huge structural defect in the.
Well, I completely agree with you, but
I don't.
I do. But on top of it, it was also to stop Syriza from doing the opposite of austerity.
Absolutely.
I mean, if Syriza was allowed to do the opposite of austerity, there were parties in the waiting. There was Podemos in Spain.
Yeah, sure.
There was the Linke in Germany. There were other parties, and these finance ministers who sit there in the Eurogroup, they're effectively politicians. They don't want their opponents on the domestic political scene to benefit. It would have raised Podemos' support. Imagine in Spain you can say, well, the Greeks are doing the opposite of austerity. The Spanish government is possible. And so there are three experts. Who do you study monetary policy from? When you go to a university today in Europe, you study monetary policy from Paul de Grove, Charles Wipros, and Barry Eichengreen. All three of these people wrote articles independently in the international press. All three of them said that the European Central Bank used its force against their mandate to dry up the Greek banking system. This was hardly mentioned in Hungary, that all three top leading academic experts, and you cannot call them pro-Syriza. Paul de Grove was a liberal MP in Belgium. None of them are even left-wing. All three of them wrote articles in which they said the European Central Bank misused its mandate to do that. This is really not well known.
And it wasn't the first time it did it. I mean, just to return to the intrinsically political nature of the ECB. In Italy, before the episode I spoke about earlier, when Silvio Berlusconi was more or less forced to resign and Mario Monti was brought in, a few months before, the ECB sent a letter to the Berlusconi government that was subsequently leaked, essentially making a list of reforms that it expected from the government.
That was still under Trichet.
I'm talking about the ECB as an institution.
But it's not independent from the president. The president makes a difference. That was still under Trichet.
Yeah,
and since Mario Draghi, we had a completely different direction. To do anything what it takes in order to have a recovery. So that's why I'm saying that this act, which is also against the mandate of the ECB, is inconsistent. It only happened because that was the political price for QE. Schäuble did not agree with QE unless Greece remains under supervision and he has the capacity to set an example against Podemos and others. So please,
Greece is not under QE.
Exactly, not to allow Greece, exactly, to have a kind of special
not so different from
test.
what we argued.
It's very different because we have to mention bloody Wolfgang Schäuble. We speak about austerity.
I was trying not to mention
we speak about austerity and everything without mentioning Schäuble. I think this is a whitewashing of Schäuble, who is largely responsible for most of the decisions that have been causing all this pain and harm.
Sure. But I also think even Mario Draghi constantly...
And Weidmann also, but Weidmann is less...
but even Mario Draghi, he constantly talks about, fiscal policy, labour market policy, even Draghi does it. In what capacity does a central banker constantly talk about what labour market reforms governments must do, what fiscal policies governments must follow? So I think Mario Draghi is, of course, a massive improvement over Trichet, but I think the intrinsically biased, pro-capital, political nature of the ECB remains true even on the...
Can I say something to that? Because it's very interesting. You raise a central banker in the EU talks about fiscal policy and monetary policy, while on the other hand you have the European Commission, and the European Commission is part of the Troika. Now the European Commission is supposed to represent the so-called Europe 2020 competitiveness program of the EU. The Europe 2020 is about being, a region, the most competitive region of the global economy, based on high value-added production, based on a knowledge economy, etc. So it's all about investment into education, investment into research, health, etc., etc. At what point during the debates about the Eurozone did the Commission represent this way of thinking in the Troika? Because I never saw them say the two are not unconnected. They should have said to Greece, first of all, spend 6-7% on education, spend 3% on innovation, spend 10% on health, and once you've done that, we can talk about the rest of the budget. But at no point did they say this. Greece is one.
Or you didn't listen. I mean, maybe you should just say you didn't hear. Maybe you should just say.
Look at the budget. Look at the budget.
I can prove you.
Look at the budget of Greece, László.
But you are saying that the Commission never said. I will show you a lot of text where the Commission said. Okay, so you just say that you didn't listen.
Okay, maybe the Commission said it, but they certainly didn't enforce it. The Commission was part of the Troika
because it doesn't have the capacity to enforce.
That I acknowledge, but effectively at the end of the day, what matters is Greece was a country under reform which is spending the least on education, the least on innovation. It was cutting its healthcare expenditure half. At that point, the European Commission should have been as strong, so that people like me who actually pay attention should have noticed a confrontation between the European Commission and the European, whoever else is applying austerity, say the IMF, supporting, enforcing the Europe 2020 agenda. That would have been their role. They were the ones responsible for this, not the European Central Bank, who actually have no mandate to talk about fiscal policy or labor market.
There's no fiscal union. Let's not forget, there's no fiscal union. Fiscal union does not exist at the moment, and what you are emphasizing is that the European Commission, from whatever source, should have supplemented the Greek budget.
No. They should have said to Greece, before any reform happens in Greece, spend from your own budget, because we have Europe 2020, and there is no clause in Europe 2020 which says it doesn't apply to poor countries or crisis countries. We never said that.
But there was a decision. Yes. Unfortunately, that was a...
Yeah, so they should have said, first of all, invest in the capacity to create larger output. Once you're investing in your future, we can talk about, this is what reforms are. They always talk about reforms. When you look into what reforms are, it's like across the board cuts to public expenditure, freezing the wages of public employees, firing people, flexibilizing the labor market. Under the reforms, you will never say there is a conditionality that you actually have to finance your educational system to function properly. You actually have to function your healthcare. They did the opposite. They cut the healthcare expenditure in Greece to half, and
who cut?
Don't tell me that the Greek governments were independent.
They were not independent, but they did.
It was in the memoranda. It was
yes,
the memoranda,
which was voted for by the Greek parliament.
Yeah, but let's not be naive.
Under duress.
Let's not be naive. If they don't vote for it, then basically they don't get the money and the country goes bankrupt.
The Greek was not able to finance itself from the financial markets, and it was only given loans by official sources, other member states, under punitive conditions.
Which they wanted to enforce, as Varoufakis would say, we should have allowed Greece to go bankrupt in 2009.
Yeah.
We should
but
have allowed,
they also opted against.
The reason why they didn't allow Greece to go bankrupt actually was because it was the big banks who were lending to Greece. Where was the Greek debt? It was held by Deutsche Bank, ING, BNP Paribas. They kept them alive. They did not allow them to go bankrupt. And therefore, they impose this conditionality.
I would also add more in general. It is not in any way unusual for a country that doesn't have a central bank, whose public debt does not have the guarantee of a central bank, in this case the central bank, to at some point come under financial speculation, to not to be able to service its debt, and to essentially not be able to finance itself on capital markets. Eurozone countries essentially borrow in what is a foreign currency because they don't control the currency, they don't control the interest rates, which are controlled by ECB. So, people say, oh, but all this is a result of this sovereign debt crisis that László mentioned, which in turn was caused by countries having excessive public debt, like Italy, Greece, and so on. When in fact, and this implies that having a high public debt automatically exposes you to financial speculation. That is not true. The ECB itself, in various reports, has said, and one in particular, a country that issues debt in its own currency, a central bank that issues debt in its own currency, can never be subject to default. So, and which implies that you can never come under financial speculation.
Yeah,
and I think this was clearly shown in 2011 and 2012. So the sovereign debt crisis, massive speculation against the sovereign debt of periphery countries, interest rates that were reaching sky high levels. How was all this stopped? By Mario Draghi uttering one phrase: "We will do in 2012. We will do whatever it takes to save the euro." Speculation stopped the next day. That's the power that a central bank has. Just by uttering a few words, he put the financial markets in their place. Because central banks are ultimately, especially when you're a very powerful central bank like the European Central Bank, are the ones that rule, not financial markets. 10 seconds to stop the speculation. He didn't even have to actually intervene in the bond markets to stop the speculation. Because now the financial markets knew, what that phrase means is that if we try to raise the interest rates above a certain level, the ECB will intervene and bring the rates down. That's essentially what that phrase meant. So we should never forget when we talk about, but Greece was under attack by speculators, but Italy was under attack by speculators. Yes, but this was only possible because these countries lacked a central bank and their debt lacked the backing of a central bank. Now that problem has been partially resolved, through various programs, including the quantitative easing program. But it's still a partial solution because now, Mario Draghi's statement led to the OMT program, which basically states that the ECB will intervene in with unlimited purchases if a country is under financial stress, but that comes with conditionality, which means more austerity. And so that's why no country has until now applied for the OMT. So the OMT has for now been replaced by quantitative easing, which is kind of an OMT with relatively little conditionality, except for the sort of basic Maastricht rules of low deficits and so on. But in the context of the tapering of quantitative easing, it remains to be seen. It's not impossible to imagine that financial instability reemerges once again at some point in the future, because the ECB has still not yet been transformed into a kind of normal central bank, which essentially guarantees all public debt without conditionality.
I have to be fair. I really do disagree with both of you. I think that fundamentally, when Draghi said that we will take whatever it takes, we'll do whatever it takes to save the euro, contained in that was the purchase of sovereign debt. By the market understood that what that phrase means is that he will buy sovereign debt. That's what put an end to the crisis. Now, under the existing regulation and rules, he's not allowed to do that. So what he did is contrary to the laws establishing the ECB. This entire quantity...
That's not entirely true, though, because
it is entirely true.
No, it's not true. The ECB... No, technically speaking, the ECB cannot buy debt on the primary market. There's no rule that says that the ECB cannot buy debt on the secondary markets. So I must, in this sense, I must defend the ECB. It's not a direct violation of the rules because it's buying debt on the secondary market, which is not outlawed by the...
It's outlawed in the sense that if the issuer is able to issue into the secondary market, because in the secondary market there is one fixed purchaser, the secondary market falls away, and it's a see-through it's a look-through transaction, and therefore the correct interpretation of the rule is that he's not allowed to do that, because he's just using the secondary market to evade the fundamental purpose of the regulation.
Yeah,
so
I agree with the analysis, but technically I think it's debatable.
No. The Federal Reserve is not allowed to do that.
But that's what quantitative easing is, though. Even in the US and in any country.
Yeah, but in terms of the Federal Reserve, there are serious constraints on what portion of the debt he can purchase that was issued after a given date, in order to preserve the integrity of this rule. That was not the case with respect to the ECB. What I really want to say, though, apart from this point, is that what you say is understandable and has my full sympathy, but it gets you nowhere. It makes no difference. The position of capital in the structure is what it is, and it will govern what happens, whatever you say at the present time. The name of this game is quite different. It's highly relevant to Italy, because I think the next major crisis is going to happen in Italy, and it's going to happen in the next 18 months. You now have an Italian banking system where over 20% of the consumer loans are non-performing. You do have a sovereign risk debt of 133% of GDP. You have horrible numbers. You have no economic growth. You have nothing, and the markets are going to gang up on you. Now,
if the ECB allows them to.
No.
Yeah, it's fundamental.
The numbers are just too big. The ECB is not going to be able to withstand this. Now, what the Greeks should have done, and what the Italians should be doing now, in order to deal with this situation, is the Greeks should have developed, as this crisis was emerging, a totally credible, thoroughly worked out program for exiting the euro.
Totally agree.
And that is what they should have had in their briefcase when they walked in to negotiate with Schäuble and company. And say, look, guys, here's what we want. Give it a thought. We're going back to the hotel, and give us a call when you have finished your deliberations. and tell you what, if you don't like it, that's fine. We are leaving, and we have a program. All it takes for me is to make one telephone call in Athens, and we are out of here. Now, and in that process, in that program for getting out of the euro, should have contained provisions that are seriously punitive vis-a-vis the European banking system. So it should have been formulated on the basis that we're not going to have access to the international capital markets. We're going to have to rely on our own currency, but we have no debt.
A devaluation of 2/3.
Devaluation of 2/3, and we have no debt.
A complete collapse of the banking system, effectively having to nationalize your banking system. If you are finance minister, Peter,
that's what I do.
You would not dare to do it. You would not dare to
do it. I would. Don't have no doubt about it. Because I grew up
I want them in our government.
I was the president of New York Bank for 20 years. I know how to play this game. That's how you play this game. And say, okay, Mr. Schäuble, here you go. You call up your friends at the Deutsche Bank and ask for their advice and see what they'll tell you, because we are out of here. And that's what the Italians should be doing right now.
Completely agree.
Nationalize the banks, write down the debt, devalue the currency, and say, bye.
I completely agree.
Impose capital controls.
Impose capital controls, the works.
Jesus. I would not dare to do it.
We already have capital controls in the Eurozone.
It would make the Italian economy collapse tomorrow.
No, it wouldn't.
My reading was that they should have developed a parallel currency. I think a parallel currency would have been the good idea.
Totally confusing.
It's a patch.
It's a patch, totally confusing. Okay, thank you very much,
Thank you.
everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
He told us what to do, so.